Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham, where Team Needham discusses everything healthcare. I am your host, Shawn Needham, along with my wonderful wife, Janet, and our producer, Lindsay, and we are streaming live in the Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy Studio in Moses Lake, Washington. I have the privilege today of having Dr. Wendy Doran on our show today. And as always, speaking of our show, you can find us here live on my personal Facebook page or the Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy's YouTube site. Also, any of the major podcast forums. So SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, all those you can listen there also. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Subscribe to the Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy YouTube channel so you do not miss any episodes. As you know, I've got some fancy eyeglasses on today. I don't like these. My Oakleys are broke. So go ahead. You can make fun of me. But without them, I could not read Dr. Doran's impressive resume. So let me go ahead when I introduce her. So she is double board certified in general psychiatry and addiction medicine. Trained at University of Miami and Harvard Longwood program. Practicing since 1998. Mostly worked in private practice in Florida until 2015. She got interested in treatment of addiction. She worked in 2015 and 2019 helping people overcome addictions to alcohol and drugs. And all the way from Florida to Alaska. She picks Alaska to live in. Quite a variation of weather for sure. She moved in 2019 on a grant to treat underserved people with addiction. So that's kind of her passion is addiction. And we're going to talk about addiction today. She's interested. This is very interesting. I had a contact call with her last week, and there's a lot of link between childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and later development of addiction and mental health issues. So without further ado, Dr. Doran, welcome to our show.
Glad to be here.
So go ahead and tell us, first of all, you are incredibly qualified and you've got an impressive resume. So go ahead. If I missed anything, tell us a little bit about how maybe your personal story about, how you treat patients and why you got into addiction medicine.
Well, I've always been interested in, what makes people tick? Why do they behave the way they do? And some of my own personal experiences too influenced my career choice. I come from a family with a lot of addiction. My father struggles with alcoholism. So does my brother. I've had my own struggles in the past. And that really led me to kind of want to study and learn as much as I could about what causes people to, look for a solution to their problems like addiction versus something healthier. And once they've made that choice, what makes it so easy for some people to accept help and climb out of that, whereas other people really struggle over and over and over, maybe having to go back to rehab several times or actually die from the disease. So one of the reasons I came up to Alaska was that we have such a high rate up here of addiction, mental illness. I think we're the #1 state in the union for suicide attempts. And I actually qualified for a grant to come up here and study addiction, study trauma, which I believe most of addiction is related to childhood trauma. So it's been really interesting.
So can you expand on, explain why Alaska has a higher incidence of mental illness than the other states in the union?
I think a lot of it has to do with kind of generational trauma. So when Alaska was kind of purchased from Russia, many of the Alaskan people were living kind of very different lifestyles. They weren't, and many of them still do today. They don't necessarily live in a town where there's a grocery store and roads and schools. They live in remote areas where they live off the land and they fish, they hunt, they gather blueberries. So their lives are organized very similarly to the way people lived before kind of industrialization. So when we decided to take over Alaska, a lot of missionaries came here. And they thought the most important thing is for these Alaskan kids to kind of go to a regular school, learn regular ways of doing things. So they would take these children out of their tribes, out of their villages, and force them to go away to boarding school. when they were in boarding school, they weren't allowed to speak their own language. And there was a lot of abuse that happened to these kids. So I think it's just the generations of abuse and trauma that have kind of set up Native Alaskans for having these issues. And it's also partly genetic. For example, part of my ancestry is Irish. My dad is half Irish. And we know that Irish people are in some way genetically vulnerable more than some other people are to addiction. It's the same thing with natives. So Native Americans have a much higher genetic predisposition to addiction.
And when we are describing addiction, is it a certain kind of addiction, alcohol, drugs, gambling, or are they all kind of related? Can you expand on that?
So I think all addictions are related, but definitely alcohol. There's a strong genetic predisposition for alcoholism in both Native Americans, Native Alaskans, and Irish people. But really, when I think of what addiction is just a kind of an adaptation to your environment. So we think of it as a maladaptive response. But when you think about somebody who's been traumatized by caregivers, people are looking to have a safe relationship, especially as children. We need a safe adult caregiver to kind of teach us what does safety look like? What does connection look like? What does attachment look like? When you don't have that, you're going to look for some other way to soothe your nervous system and find security, safety, and a feeling of reduced anxiety and overall well-being. So it's kind of natural that if you find a food or a drink of alcohol, which kind of will soothe you, sedate you, or maybe it'll be marijuana. It could be Facebook. You know, people today, they're looking for connection when they're spending hours on Facebook. But what they're actually getting is the loss of hours out of their day. So it's all a similar mechanism.
So you mentioned in our pre-call that, a lot of times when people go through treatment, they can, in a 90-day program, they can be, recovered, but not everybody can. And you're kind of doing some studies on that. Is that correct? About why some people never really get better beyond that?
I think it has a lot to do with how much adversity you had as a child. So there was a study done in 1995 called the ACEs study, and it was done by some researchers in California. I think it was Felitti and Anda, Vincent Felitti. And it was a huge study. It was 17,000 people, and I think it was Kaiser Permanente. So 17,000 people, 14,000 of them participated. It was conducted over a 10-year period. And they were asked all kinds of questions about adversity in childhood. Did you have emotional abuse, physical abuse? Was there sexual abuse? Did you live with an addicted parent? Did you have a parent who had a mental illness? Did you have a parent or caregiver who went to jail? So they asked all these kind of questions, and they came up with 10 kind of, it was like a 10-point scale. So let's say you had a mentally ill parent. Well, I could tell you from my own perspective, I had a mom with mental illness, a dad with alcoholism. They didn't divorce, but they did separate multiple times. So that would be another point. My ACEs score ends up being a 6. So your highest could be a 10. If you look at children who had an ACEs score of 4 or more, they had much higher rates of heart disease, cancer, immunological problems, autoimmune diseases, depression, anxiety. And the rates of the diseases that they developed were in direct proportion to the score. So if you looked at, for example, they looked at women with addiction, and they used some epidemiological measures, and they found that you could directly correlate alcoholism in women 65% to their ACEs score, drug abuse 50%, and IV drug abuse 78%. So if you look at somebody with an ACEs score of 6 or more, they're not just more likely to have an addiction, they are 4,600% more likely to have an addiction to IV drugs. So I began seeing this, direct correlation when I was treating people with addiction in Florida, particularly as you would expect, some of the people in lower socioeconomic groups. I worked for some private treatment centers, and I also worked for a state run where we would get patients straight from jail. They were told by the judge, either you go get treatment or you go to jail. And just the stories that I would hear from these men or women, grew up in the foster care system, never had a mom or a dad. Dad left when I was born. Mom was also an addict. We lived in the back of her car until we were taken away by child services. These kids were sexually abused from a young age. So the more of these ACEs that they had, generally the worse they did in treatment. So it's very important, I would say, for health professionals, particularly mental health professionals, addiction treatment providers, people in the criminal justice system. We need to be trauma informed, which basically just means we need to know about this ACEs study. We need to know what does it look like when somebody has trauma? How do they present? How does that make this person behave? Because sometimes when you look at the behavior of people who have had childhoods like that, they can seem shut down. They can seem like they're not paying attention. They can seem like they're behaving aggressively, when really they're just acting out of a traumatized nervous system that has never been able to trust other human beings.
Janet, do you have any comments on that or questions for Dr. Doran?
Yeah, I do. So it kind of, I always throw this in our podcast, coming from a mother's perspective. I imagine some of these things we see play out in school. And I feel sometimes, and I'm not saying the behavior is correct, but I feel sometimes that we shame children and judge children in situations where really they're asking for help. Can you comment on that?
Well, I have an aunt and a cousin who both work in special ed in Texas, and they're both studying trauma as well, and they are trauma informed. So they'll tell me about some of the things they encounter where the kids are coming to school, they don't have food. I mean, a lot of this has been coming up during the coronavirus, where lower income parents are dependent on the school system kind of as a place to watch their kids while they work 2 or 3 jobs, a place to feed their kids. So it's, when I talk about, multi-generational trauma, the ACEs study wasn't designed to blame parents. For example, my parents. I don't blame my parents for the fact that I have 6 ACEs. It's not my mother's fault that she has bipolar disorder. And my father was just, I think he's 3rd generation alcoholism. They only could give me what they had. But it is important that school systems, prison systems, mental health systems, addiction treatment systems, and even just your average parent understand what trauma is, what it looks like, and how to treat it. Because we can't prevent every bad thing that can happen to a child. But if we understand what's going on, we can intervene. There's a woman in California, I think, if I'm saying her name right, it's Nadine Burke Harris. And she's a pediatrician who wrote a book called The Deepest Well. And it's about, she started seeing the same thing in her pediatric patients that I started seeing in my addicted patients. And wondering if the diseases that she saw in kids, asthma, IBS, migraines, even broken bones, how related were these, what we call just, average childhood illnesses? Were these related to the traumas? And she did a bunch of studies and found that, yes, most of the diseases that we think are genetic, they're directly related to the trauma we went through as kids. And the fact that our nervous systems kind of got stuck in fight or flight. You can imagine when you're exposed to a bear, you kind of, your thinking brain goes offline. You become pure emotion, pure adrenaline. You're going to get ready to fight that bear. Well, then your nervous system, when the bear runs off, returns to normal. But if that bear is a parent who comes home every night from the bar, your nervous system is in constant fight or flight, and it kind of gets stuck there. So there are ways to intervene, though. You can have an after-school program. You can have a therapist for the child. You can teach the child yoga, meditation, art therapy, ways to calm their body down. And if you intervene early enough, you can prevent a lot of these illnesses.
So speaking of some of those therapies, can you explain, we should have done this earlier on, but can you explain the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? Because there's a big difference. Can you explain that?
The basic difference is just in the training. So a psychiatrist like me goes to medical school first, we do college, we do 4 years of medical school, and then we do, I did a 4-year residency. So the first year is a lot of just kind of like internal medicine, where we learn about things like hypertension and diabetes and neurology and the function of the brain. And then after that, you have 3 years where you learn how to diagnose and treat mental illnesses. So you'd go to a psychiatrist to find out, are the symptoms that my child or my partner or me or that I'm experiencing, are these due to a brain disease such as a stroke or a brain tumor, or are these actual psychological symptoms? And once you determine what the symptoms are due to, can they be treated with medication? A psychologist has much of the same experience in diagnosis, but they can't prescribe medications, and they won't necessarily understand all of the biology of the brain, because typically they've finished college, they've studied psychology, and then they go on for a master's in psychology or a doctorate. But there's a lot of overlap between the two. And typically I would be able to refer you to a psychologist if that's necessary, and a psychologist would be able to refer you to a psychiatrist.
So since a psychiatrist can prescribe medications, are medications the answer to a lot of these childhood traumas that create addictions?
I think medications are a very, very small piece of the puzzle. I think they can be very useful for some kinds of diseases. For example, if you have severe bipolar disorder and you can't sleep on your own and you can't regulate your emotions, then something like a mood stabilizer can be really helpful. Or if you have schizophrenia and you don't know what's real because you're hearing voices and you're having auditory hallucinations or visual hallucinations, then an antipsychotic can be very, very helpful. But I think the majority of the work that needs to be done, particularly in children, is determining, why is your child having symptoms of, let's say, inattention? This is one of the things that came up in the book I was telling you about, The Deepest Well, and then it also comes up in addiction treatment. So why would somebody be so anxious and so distracted that they can't pay attention in school? And why are they looking to self-medicate with marijuana or alcohol? Well, typically, a lot of the times this is missed too. If you go to, say, just a pediatrician or a primary care doctor, they're going to think, well, this is ADHD. The kid can't pay attention because they have attention deficit disorder. That may be true, but it may also be that the child has post-traumatic stress disorder, and the hyperactivity is kind of hyperarousal in the nervous system. And this is what I saw over and over in my patients in addictive treatment. And sometimes the only drug that they were taking is one that a lot of people consider harmless, but marijuana. So when kids start using marijuana at a young age, it can affect brain development, can lead to psychosis, can lead to anxiety, can lead to an actual withdrawal syndrome that looks a lot like irritability, anxiety, and short temper. But really, it's the direct effect of the drug.
So with marijuana being legal now, there's a lot more, younger generation, especially, that are using it just recreational. But have you seen an increase in mental issues because of the use of marijuana?
I don't know that I could tell you for sure, without doing some epidemiological studies. Is the increase in mental health issues due to the marijuana, or are people using more marijuana because they have more mental health issues? I don't know. What came first, the chicken or the egg?
Right.
I can tell you, in my patients that already have mental health issues, it seems to worsen them. Now, the patient will tell you, oh, no, this helps me. But when I show them, some scales they've filled out, or, if I give them, there are some scales that we use, like there's one called the HAM-D that can measure the degree of your depression. There's another one that measures, gives you points for how anxious you're feeling. And when they look at the objective data, they can see they're actually feeling worse since they've started using that drug. But that is kind of one of the hallmarks of addiction too, is that people tend to be in denial about what they're doing. And that's what makes it difficult to treat, is that many times people, they only remember the good. We call it euphoric recall. They can remember, but I felt really good when I ate that chocolate chip cookie. They don't remember that they kept eating the whole bag for 4 years and developed obesity.
Right. Yeah. It's that dopamine hit, right? It's neurotransmitter that we just like, that dopamine. So can you explain how does diet affect mental illness?
So I think diet is probably the most important piece of the puzzle, and I think it's one that we overlook daily in the U.S. healthcare system. And I think the reason for that, when I went to medical school, I don't recall that we even took a class in nutrition, to be honest. I really don't think we did, and that's not uncommon. I don't know if it's just there's so much to learn that it gets pushed to the outskirts. I'm not sure what it is. But primarily what we learn in medical school is pathology, pathophysiology. We learn, what can go wrong and how to treat it. And that's important. But when you think about all of your major diseases, they all have, a medication that you can take for the most part. And you might take that medication once a day. You might take it 2 or 3 times a day. Well, your food and your nutrition, you're doing every day of your life, at least 3 times a day. Sometimes people will eat 6 meals a day. We know there's a link between, let's say, diabetes and your weight and your nutrition. We know there's links to hypertension, but really there's links to every single disease. And if you think about like a traumatized brain that's already having trouble paying attention or dealing with inflammation, the last thing you want to do to that brain is give it a bunch of sugar and artificial chemicals, which are going to further disrupt all kinds of pathways. So there's been a lot of research on kids with autism or kids with seizure disorders that a ketogenic diet can help those kids. And really a ketogenic diet, when you're not looking at specific macros like fats, it's basically just eliminating everything artificial and everything with sugar and simple carbs. And those diets work. I mean, before we started really using widespread anti-seizure drugs, we treated seizure disorders in kids primarily with a ketogenic diet. And it can be very, very effective.
Janet, do you have any comments on that?
I do. We have a very close friend, business partner in our community where, they actually were able to stop using all the medications and control their daughter's seizure with food. And I am just impressed to hear that we are talking about the subject today with an addiction as well, that, food plays such a big role. And would you say it's just all the fast food that we're using in our diets rather than healthy choices that we, where do you see the food? Is it just because we can shop and it's so accessible to us, or our choices are just not as good as they used to be? And do you have any thoughts on that?
I think we really need to educate people on what healthy living is. And I think we have to understand the way the brain works too. So as we were saying before, we like that dopamine hit, right? We can easily get that in the food that's in our grocery stores. I mean, we know you have to go around the perimeter of the grocery store and really get the healthy proteins, the produce, the fruit. But if you are a kid, who doesn't have good parenting, who's had some trauma, who feels lonely, and who is having cravings for some kind of connection or feeling good, they're going to reach for that candy. And food is really one of the first addictions that we can do because it's so easy to get. So a child may not be able to get right away something like marijuana or alcohol, but he can get fast food. And I think even over the past 50 years, look at all the additives and the GMOs and all of the substances that we're putting in our foods. We didn't do that 50 years ago. And if you look at the obesity rates, how they've risen, part of that, I think, was just when we started telling people that we should eat more grains and more carbs instead of the fats. There was some research done. I think it was Ansel Keys who said he believed, he was a nutritionist, that heart disease was directly correlated to the amount of saturated fat in your diet. Well, we've since discovered that's not true. So that research was flawed. But based upon that research, we came up with the FDA guidelines for what we should eat. So that's starting to change. But I think if you're dealing with any kind of mental illness or physical illness for that matter, definitely lower your sugar, get more exercise, get blood going to the brain, get the right kind of light, lower your blue light, eat healthy fats, because that's going to help you stay healthy and have your hormones function the way they're designed to.
Well, you were talking too about sugars being converted to alcohol in our pre-connection call. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, it's just the way that sugars are broken down in the brain. So some of the way that certain sugars are broken down are going to present themselves. You have to think of food like information. So food is protein, it's fats, it's carbohydrates, but it's also information to your brain. And food information in the form of food is going to tell your genes how to express themselves. So if you are giving your brain a bunch of sugars that are then converted into alcohols, your brain is going to literally express its DNA differently than it would if you were eating healthy vegetables and fruits. So you just have to you have to be aware of how things are broken down, how they're metabolized, and what that might feel like to somebody who has an addicted brain, or a brain with ADHD, or a brain with bipolar disorder.
And genetically, I would say that some people are very predisposed to problems with that. If you look at different, like the Native American and certain other people might be very genetically predisposed to having issues if they're having too many carbs. Is that what?
Yeah. We know, for example, that there's a book written by a woman who works at Mass General Hospital. There's actually a unit there now on nutrition and psychiatry, and she runs that unit. Her name is Uma Naidu, and she wrote a book called This Is Your Brain on Food. And she describes how when she's working with patients who have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, that when they alter their diets to include a lot of sugar and carbohydrates, they have more episodes. They have more manic episodes. They have more episodes of psychosis. And just by reducing the amount of, let's say, gluten or sugar in the diet, they can reduce the number of hospitalizations, reduce the number of episodes. Now, some of that may be due to, people talk about leaky gut syndrome. I'm not an expert in that, but apparently if you challenge the lining of your gut enough with substances that it doesn't like, it's kind of like repeated insults to the endothelium of the intestinal lining. Then the gut can become kind of permeable when it's not supposed to be. And certain toxins or chemicals from your food can actually get into your bloodstream that aren't supposed to. And when they get into the bloodstream, they go straight to the brain. So in medical school, we're kind of trained that each doctor works with a different system. So you have a hematologist for the blood, you have a gastroenterologist for your GI system, you have a psychiatrist for the brain, but we forget that it's all connected. And particularly the gut and the brain, the gut now is being called the second brain because there's so much immunology in the gut, and so many of our, for example, serotonin is made directly in the gut.
All of our nutrients, all of our vitamins, all of our minerals are absorbed in the gut. Not all, but most are absorbed there. So if you don't have a healthy gut, you just can't have a healthy body, period. And that includes the brain.
Well, I think it's important, to just look at the patient holistically, which is what I try to do. I don't see a broken person in front of me where there's something wrong and I need to fix it with a medication. I see a person who had trauma as a child, who had some kind of deficiency of connection, maybe with their caregiver, where they didn't learn how to self-soothe, because we learn that in tandem with another human. When a baby cries, the mom picks up the baby and that soothes the baby. And if she does that thousands and thousands of times, the baby then learns to regulate its own nervous system. But if something happens, let's say mom was depressed or addicted or in jail, the baby never learns that. The baby is going to look for something outside of itself. And that's what happens. Then, baby grows up maybe in a bad neighborhood where they didn't have access to healthy food. So you take an already kind of brain that's wired to feel a lot of fear, anxiety, and unable to calm down. You put a lot of sugar into the child. Then you put it in a school system that doesn't understand trauma. So instead they're called lazy or stupid, or given drugs for ADHD, which the child doesn't have. And it's just kind of this whole system of errors, which when you start unraveling it, there are many ways to help that person that really don't even have to include drugs at all, but just teaching the person, this is how you soothe yourself. And you have to do it carefully too, because the way that the person, so we usually look at obesity or addiction as problems, really they're solutions. They're solutions that that child picked at age 8 or 9 because they felt better. So when you try to immediately yank away that coping mechanism, if you're not careful when you're doing it, that person's not going to make it through treatment because you're taking away the one thing they know how to do to calm down.
You got to actually get to the underlying problem that started it in the first place.
Yeah. We need to do that too. We need to do that really on a national scale, because the only real way to see an end or at least a reduction in these mental illnesses is treat the disconnection, treat the parents, give the parents some skills.
Well, I agree with that. I also think too, there's such a difference even in our education with providers that have learned what development is proper and where that lies, because sometimes I think if we have parents uneducated as well as our educators not understanding the development of the human brain and the child's brain, then it just kind of manifests and keeps building on each other. And like you say, then we start labeling a situation in a person's life which really needs to be intervened with and actually be given some tools as to how to cope. And that's okay, because we all have places in our lives that we need to have some type of, instruction on how to, cope with something. I mean, we don't come with that instruction book already in place. I mean, we need others to help us. So how do we get to a place besides just coping with our pharmaceuticals to solve this? Because, I look on our streets in Washington State, we have a huge problem of homelessness. And I feel like a lot of the times this is part of what we're seeing being reflected, is that there's a person out there that probably hasn't found the tools yet to help with their trauma in their life.
Yeah, and that's really a systems problem too. There's a huge homelessness problem here. There's a huge homelessness problem in Florida. And we used to provide more community mental health services. And, you really can't blame Republicans. You can't blame Democrats on this one, because it doesn't really matter which administration was in. Mental health services are always the first to be cut. And I think it's just a lack of understanding of what is going on with these people. I think it's too easy to look at a homeless person and think, well, just get a job or stop drinking. But I think politicians and just people in general don't realize, like, they can't go back in time and see, okay, look, generation after generation of trauma, the person has no coping skills. For example, up here, so if that person was taken out of their tiny village where all they know how to do is fish and hunt, and then they're brought into Anchorage, which they've never seen a big city like this, and told, okay, get to this clinic, this 90-day program. It's overwhelming for them. It's easier for them to kind of just be homeless and end up on the street. And if it's not trauma-informed care where the person understands they really can't regulate their nervous system, they need some additional assistance, then it's just looked at as a failure of that person to complete a program. School systems can be the same way if they're not trauma informed. So I think it's a matter of educating all of these different systems, and we have to kind of be willing to put more money into it. I mean, even in Boston, where they had a really good public health system, there was a place called Massachusetts Mental Health Center. And this was a free place where you would go get an injection if you needed it. If you were homeless, they gave you food. There was all-day programming. That it no longer exists. It was just defunded. Same thing up here. We only have 3 or 4 places where you can put somebody in an inpatient setting and teach them some of these skills. So we need more funding, we need more education, and we need more services.
Well, it sounds like, individuals aren't failing in the system. The system is kind of failing them, is kind of what you're talking about. Yeah.
I would completely agree with that statement.
So explain, you had a great story about autism. Autism's, seems to be more common, and it definitely could be because of diet for sure. Explain how you had a patient, or there's a story that the GAPS diet, you can explain what that is, healed autism after 1 year.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So there's a woman, her name is Natasha Campbell McBride, and she wrote a book called the GAPS diet. And GAPS just stands for gut and psychology syndrome. And she has or had a child with autism who basically she was told by medical providers, like, there's nothing you can do. Your daughter is profoundly mentally ill. We can try these medications. Nothing was working. So she devised a diet which is just basically highly anti-inflammatory, no chemical additives, no sugar, no carbohydrates, very similar to a ketogenic diet. And her daughter was completely healed. I think she spent a year, maybe a year and a half on this diet, just all the symptoms of autism disappeared. So it's a really interesting book. I ordered it, I think, on eBay. I don't even know if it's still in print, but she believes that a lot of her daughter's symptoms were due to leaky gut syndrome, that in some people, maybe you or I could eat a lot of chemical additives in our food and not have anything more than maybe mild irritability. But some children, for whatever reason, just like some people are more susceptible to alcoholism, some human beings are more susceptible to mental health issues when they eat a lot of processed food. And it makes logical sense. And definitely there have been lots of parents who have used the GAPS diet with success.
Well, so why don't more doctors prescribe the GAPS diet or the ketogenic diet? Why do you feel that is in mainstream medicine?
Well, I could say for myself, when I trained in the 90s, we didn't have, so I finished residency in 1998, and I think the ACEs study was just starting in 1995. So we didn't really have that information. I remember when I trained, everything was very biologically based in the 90s. We learned what we thought was wrong with your brain, which we thought was some kind of a defect. We didn't learn that it was an adaptation to trauma. At least that's not what I was taught. And I went to a pretty good program, I would say. But we had a lot of new medications at the time, and there was kind of there was a belief at the time, I think, that these medications were going to fix everything. But after being in the field now for almost 25 years, I can say, are they helpful? Yes, they can be very helpful for some people. Are they the answer or the solution? I don't believe so. I think part of it also is that we didn't learn a lot about nutrition. So I don't know how comfortable a lot of doctors are with prescribing something like a diet. I think that I went and looked for my own kind of answers outside of what I was taught in medical school. And when I started reading a lot of these books on nutrition, it just made sense to me. If our genes are looking at food as information, the same way they look at medications, then why aren't we using food as a solution? And I think it has to do with ease too. I mean, it's much easier in a 10 or 15 minute visit to just say, here's a pill, this will help you, goodbye. Rather than digging into the whole trauma history, family history. And patients don't always know. So if you'd asked me at age 21 or 22, are you having depression and anxiety right now because of your upbringing? I would have said, no, there was nothing wrong with my upbringing.
Right.
My parents loved me. I think it took me a lot of reading, a lot of my own therapy, a lot of my own healing to kind of draw the connection. Because I did have anxiety in my 20s and 30s. Now I look back and say that was PTSD, but I didn't know that then. And neither did any doctor I went to. They didn't ask those kind of questions. They asked about family history in terms of a genetic link. They didn't ask any questions about trauma. So I think it's just really important that we know what questions to ask.
So what about, the patient we had on that her seizures were cured from keto diet? She was on 5 or 6 different medications, and she went off all of them and was seizure free after being on the keto diet. Now, I got to think that, Big Pharma lost out big time on this gal, thousands of dollars a month. So is there any economic incentive that in our healthcare system about, Big Pharma pushing these things and why we don't push diet?
Well, I would have to think so. I think Big Pharma has more of an influence than we like to think, even on medical school curricula. Big Pharma puts a lot of the money into studies. So I'm interested in trauma and addiction, but I may not have $1 million to go design a study. So if I want to do a study, a lot of the times it's going to have to be, someone's going to have to fund that study for me. And the studies can kind of be designed to show what you want them to show. I did some research when I was, when I first got out of residency, I thought I wanted to do academic medicine. So I did that for about a year before I realized this isn't really my interest. But I did a lot of studies on antidepressants and things like that. And it was just interesting to me that the way the study was designed was basically, you knew what you were going to get. But I'm not saying that every study is wrong or, everything is flawed, but definitely there is, big pharma needs to make money. They have these products, they want to sell them. And it's not just big pharma though. It's also just us as individuals. It's trickier to adhere to a ketogenic diet. We all love carbs. They're rewarding, they taste good, they're yummy. So I'm sure as a parent, it can be difficult to get the child to adhere to a diet like this. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it.
And we were talking about too that, sometimes with the ketogenic diet, it's basically low carb, high fat. And we were talking about that we really shouldn't be surprised about that it works for many mental illnesses and seizures, since there's kind of some commonality there. They all originate in the CNS, but the brain is mostly lipids and cholesterol. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, since I've learned a lot about diet and nutrition and its impact on mental health, it makes me think that maybe the rise in the ADHD and autism and some of these other illnesses are directly related to diet. I mean, when we told everyone, okay, don't eat fat because that's going to give you a heart attack, let's eat a bunch of grains, 7 to 10 servings of grains a day. I know, for example, when I removed grains from my diet, I felt so much better. So I definitely feel like my body and brain function better. I have more energy on a higher fat diet. And so there's other things that we do too, though. We put younger and younger women on birth control pills. How is that impacting their brain function? So we are a society that eats a lot of processed foods and takes a lot of medications. I think France is second to us, but we are the number one in the entire world of how many prescription medications we take.
Wow. That's an alarming statistic. Can you talk at all about the statin medications for cholesterol, for lowering cholesterol and brain function? Have you seen any correlation, any mental illness or any kind of CNS diseases related in your practice due to that?
So I don't see a lot of elderly, just because people that are in addiction treatment, typically it'll be like age 18 to 65, although there are certainly people who come in after the age of 65. But from what I've read, they're wondering now if maybe the statins have something to do with dementia. And I don't know, I haven't read all the studies recently. But anything we put in our body is going to have an effect. And we know that every drug that we take has side effects. So I think obviously follow your doctor's recommendations, but whatever you can do with a healthy lifestyle, diet, exercise, the right kind of light, reducing your exposure to trauma. And if you have trauma, get it treated. I would say do all of those things before, thinking, okay, well, I can just take another medication, because you may not need it.
So let's speak of lights. You were talking about sad lights, and you can explain what those are, especially way up in Alaska when we don't have a lot of sunshine during the year, and how it affects our vitamin D function. Can you talk about lights and vitamin D?
Well, I think we know that light exposure, we are beings that depend on a circadian rhythm. So typically when it starts to get dark out, we're going to start producing more melatonin. The melatonin tells our brain when it's time to go to sleep. But melatonin also affects other chemicals as well. So it can affect our sex hormones, our testosterone, our estrogen. It has impact on mood, which is why people can sometimes report seasonal affective disorder symptoms as it starts to get dark this time of the year. And it's particularly prevalent up here in Alaska because we have 6 months of low light, and then we have 6 months of a lot of sunshine. But yeah, the sad light is something that I started using when I was up in Boston doing my residency. And basically it looks like a little kind of a table lamp, and it has units of light, which are called lux. It has 10,000 lux, or 10,000 units of light. And it's supposed to mimic just the natural sunshine that you would get for 30 or 40 minutes per day. And if you study near it or read near it, there's definitely, I can tell a difference in my mood when I use it. I feel like I have more energy. I'm a little bit more optimistic. I'm less grouchy. So it's basically, it's just working by signaling our melatonin. We also know too that it's important to reduce exposure to certain kinds of light, like blue light. So when we're sitting in front of computers all day, like we're doing now, these are blue light blocking glasses that I have on right now.
Oh, cool.
We know that if we are exposed to too much blue light, that is particularly, it suppresses melatonin more than any other wavelength of light. There's also some research that if you expose yourself more to red light, that can heal inflammation and possibly even, I don't like to use the word cure, but can definitely reduce some of your inflammatory type diseases. So people will sometimes purchase red light devices to help with that.
And vitamin D. What's the importance of vitamin D, especially during the winter?
So vitamin D, you definitely need. It helps with all kinds of biochemical processes in the body. It's important for mood. It's important to reduce inflammation as well. And when you're not getting exposed to enough light, you're not going to have enough vitamin D. So up here, we supplement it. And you could probably talk more as to what's a good source of vitamin D to take, because I know there's also, if you're not absorbing it correctly, then it's not going to help you to take a supplement. But I would say, get a good quality supplement.
Janet, can you comment on vitamin D a little bit?
I totally agree with what Dr. Doran is saying. Good quality supplements important because we know that supplement companies are not regulated as well as pharmaceuticals, which is good and bad in many ways. But you really get what you pay for. So if it's really inexpensive, you're probably not getting a quality product. Over the years, we've used a company that stands behind their product. Orthomolecular is one. But there are other companies out there that give good products. But I think one of the first things that a person should decide is where are you purchasing it. If you are in question of what the supplement can do for you, I think having a good place to purchase it at for the person to be able to explain to you what it is and the quality of it is important. And I agree, 5,000 units is a good place to start on a daily. There's also products that you can take once a week, 50,000 units. And there are tests out there to see that aren't really expensive to make sure that you are at a good level. I mean, we've had some clients that even where we live that are snowbirds that have found that they really need to supplement a lot more throughout the winter months versus the summer months, partly because they just aren't absorbing it. And that could be partly genetics. Some people seem to have better genetics for maintaining or retaining vitamin D production in their skin. Anything else you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think one thing too is it's not just, in northern latitudes necessarily, or even in the winter, which, vitamin D is produced in our skin in response to sunlight, for sure. And it, the sunlight, especially in northern latitudes, doesn't hit us as direct as it does at the equator. So even if we are out in the sun enough, which most of us are not because we work inside, and if we don't work inside anymore, what do? We cover up and with sleeves, or we use sunscreen, which negates the production of vitamin D. So I will say that almost everybody, that's a strong statement, almost everybody probably needs to supplement vitamin D. I think it's important too that you know what your level is. And normal is not, the normal level is like 30 to 100, but normal is not 30. We want optimal. So you really want a level of a little bit above 60 to 100. And I will tell you, we had a patient in Alaska. This is no lie. She was having to take 50,000 units every day to actually get adequate levels. Now, obviously, she probably had some malabsorption issues, but obviously she was in Alaska in the winter too, and she was way up north, so she was having almost no sunshine. So maybe not much of a surprise, but I think if there's one supplement you can take, it's probably vitamin D3. It's important to get vitamin D3 too, not vitamin D2, because vitamin D3 is the active form of the vitamin D. Vitamin D is fat soluble, so it is absorbed better if you take it with food or some kind of some kind of fat even possibly, but at least some kind of food to stimulate that acid production in your stomach so it gets absorbed better. But also because it is fat soluble, it stays in your body up to 19 days because it's got a long half-life. So you don't have to take it every day, like Janet said. You can actually take it once a week. 5,000 units a day is a pretty good baseline. If you take 50,000 units once a week, it actually ends up being like 7,200 units a day. So I'm a big believer in vitamin D because it does so much for mental health and your bones and your immune system. And it's very inexpensive and most people are low in it. So yeah, but that's vitamin D. So what about, you were talking earlier, I know tanning gets a bad rap, but you say in Alaska, there's people that tan in the winter and you're okay with that, correct?
I think if it's, if you limit the exposure, I mean, I have friends who are dermatologists that would be horrified at hearing me say this, especially for mood. I mean, you definitely feel better. We know that like you were saying, vitamin D can affect mood. And up here, when we just have so little light exposure, if you do 5 or 10 minutes in a tanning bed, some of the people up here swear by it. They say they feel so much better and they just feel more optimistic and their mood stays more stable.
So, Janet, do you have any more questions for Dr. Doran?
So I'm always curious how you feel that our medical system can kind of turn to a different model, because I feel like I have conversations daily with clients that they are being treated, like you said, for just the one thing, like maybe their knee hurts, but they really have something else that is happening at the same time. And how do we get back to a holistic approach for our patients? Because I heard throughout our conversation today that, really that's kind of how you're approaching your client, that you're looking at the whole human body, their brain, what else is going on, their nutrition, their sleep. So what is your gut feeling as to how we can pivot this back into more of a patient holistic approach?
Well, I definitely think there are a lot of doctors now that are doing kind of a direct primary care, and that's pretty close to what I did when I was in private practice. So I tried to offer the most comprehensive services and just, kind of like a one-stop shop. But it just depends. I mean, it depends the availability of the doctors in your area. So if there is a direct primary care, I think that's always a good thing to get involved in. And even then the doctors, we as the physicians have to be careful where we accept employment too, because my current system right now, I'm working for IHS and they give us plenty of time. So I have 90 minutes to do an initial evaluation. And I think that's very fair. So in an hour and a half, I can spend a lot of time getting to know that individual. And they really, I would say this healthcare system is one of the reasons why I took this position. They really care about giving enough time to really get to know that person. But then it becomes a systems issue, as we were saying before. So I may have a lot of time to spend with that person, but let's say I determine that they need inpatient treatment. If we don't have that in Alaska, then, and I run into that all the time, just where we just don't have. So I don't know if it's just that we need to attract the right kind of investors. I don't know, in Florida, one of the reasons I wanted to leave Florida actually was just that there were too many private investors with the wrong kind of motives, where they would come into the healthcare system and say, oh, look, we can make X amount of dollars and we can do it in a year and a half and then we'll fold. And I don't know what's going to happen to the patients, but we made our million or whatever that they determine. And you just can't have that kind of mindset in medicine. I mean, it is a business and you do need to make a profit, but it can't be at the expense of what the patients truly need. So I have answers for you, but.
Yeah, well, I think you answered it a little bit earlier on in your first statement, a couple paragraphs back, is that, doctors need to really be in charge of the healthcare system. Again, I'm going to guess the investors you're talking about were not doctors. They were people with deep pocketbooks wanting to make some money. And, I'm with you. We got to make money. I'm a capitalist. I mean, we have to make money, but, we also have to make, we also have to realize that people are involved too. And, what our ultimate goal is. So I appreciate you stating that, because one of the missions of our podcast is to just educate and empower consumers that they need to take care of their health. And one of those is to find a doctor that they can work with and get a personal relationship with. And a lot of people don't realize that because they have been so indoctrinated that they have to go to a doctor that their insurance company tells them they have to go to because it's in their network and all that. And that is just absolutely not true, because that might not be the best doctor. So patients need to take charge, and doctors need to take charge of the healthcare system again, for sure. So, Dr. Doran, in our final minutes here, how would you like to sum up our conversation today? And if people have any questions, how can they get a hold of you?
So I would say, just to sum up, I think it's really important that we start educating all the systems in America, the schools, mental health care, traditional health care, what trauma is, what it looks like, what does a person act like who has trauma, and how can I help them? How can I prevent trauma in my children? If they did suffer some kind of trauma, what can I do? Just so that we understand, addiction doesn't just occur in a vacuum, and neither do any other illness. So they largely occur in response to trauma. We like to think of addiction as something that's the fault of drug dealers in the schoolyard, but really it's what happened to that person. Why are they suffering? And this was the adaptation or the solution that they found. It is treatable, though. All of these things are treatable, and there are people, including myself, who can help. So right now I'm just working. The best way to reach me would be to just call the Fireweed Clinic, which is in Anchorage, Alaska. It's through South Central Foundation. So I'm not taking private clients right now because I'm specifically doing this kind of work. Yeah.
I love it. So you've been a great wealth of information today, Dr. Doran. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us today. There's a lot of stuff that came out of this conversation today, and I so appreciate it. So thank you so much for being on, and we will definitely be in touch.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So Thursday, tune in for our midweek podcast. It will be Wednesday this week because I am leaving Thursday. So tune in Wednesday. We will have actually another psychiatrist on. So this psychiatrist is Dr. Z. She is out of Missouri, and she has some alternative treatments. One of them is ketamine. She does some ketamine infusions, and she'll be talking about why she got out of mainstream psychiatry to do some traditional stuff, or do some non-traditional treatments. So tune in then 8 to 9 a.m. Wednesday on my personal Facebook page and the Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy's YouTube. Dr. Doran, thank you so much for being on today. You've been listening to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. Thank you so much.